Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and on this new series of History of Hull that we'll be looking at every so often, we're going to be taking a look at the history of some of Hull's parks. And given that this is a lockdown episode, where better to start than a park that no longer exists? In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the history of Hull's Zoological Gardens. There are a few myths about the Zoological Gardens, basically mostly around where they actually were. Some people think that they were around where the Polar Bear pub now stands, although that's possibly being confused with the Botanical Gardens, which were indeed around here just a little further along Springbank West, where Hymers is today. It could also be because there was a Polar Bear pub directly across the road from the gardens, but it wasn't this Polar Bear pub, but another tavern that existed about halfway along this particular stretch of Springbank. Some people also think it's where the pub that used to be called the Old Zoological stands, but again, no, that pub stands on the site of an old railway station, the Botanic Gardens station, that existed around the same time as the Zoological Gardens. In fact, the Zoological Gardens were on the north side of Springbank, roughly in the area between Morpeth Street and Peel Street, as you can see when we fade the 1853 Ordnance Survey map in over the modern Google Map view. There are some local references to the location, but they're commemorations of it rather than direct evidence. The polar bear sculptures on the streetlights at the end of Albany Street, for instance, or the river horse, a statue of a hippopotamus on Cranbourne Street, and the elephant trail, a series of decorated paving stones along Springbank that reference the trail that the elephants were marched along from their original temporary stables on Prime Street to their permanent home in the gardens. The main proponents for zoological gardens were Hull's wealthy elite. They felt that because of the incredible growth of Hull over the previous few decades, certainly during the early years of the Industrial Revolution, that the city needed some kind of symbol of its status and prosperity. And menageries had been used as a symbol of wealth and status for centuries. Kings and emperors had had them, for instance, and members of the gentry. And in Hull, one of the main movers of this was a chap called Dr. James Alderson, and he certainly put forward a very compelling idea that a zoological gardens would be excellent for the education in natural history for the people of the area. Very few objections were raised by local folk and the plans went ahead. The company was formed, shares were floated in order to raise revenue, and construction began. They started shipping animals as early as 1839, housing them in temporary accommodation along Anlaby Road and down Prime Street. And in 1840, the inaugural meeting of the newly crowned society, the Hull and East Riding of York Zoological Society, was held, with Dr. Alderson himself as the chair. And in that they laid out the plans for the zoological gardens, things like meetings and talks, things to help educate people and, of course, promote healthful exercise. Springbank was chosen as the location because at that time it was on the outskirts of the town, and if you look at the shape of Hull on early maps from the mid-19th century, you'll note that Springbank was the last of the main roads out of Hull to be developed, and that's mainly because of the titular springs of Springbank. Not plentiful enough or clean enough to provide any meaningful drinking water, they nonetheless turned the area into a swamp, making building difficult and travel messy. This would become important later in the history of the gardens. Because of this status as an unfeasible choice for any other meaningful development at the time, the society bought the land and began building their zoological gardens. On the 5th of October 1840, the gardens officially opened. The entrance fee was set originally at £1 for adults and £6 for children, and around 800 people attended the opening along with wealthy supporters such as Sir Clifford Constable. But even though the zoological gardens hadn't even finished being built at the time the opening day rolled along, there were still huge amounts of entertainment to be had for the crowds who turned up. One of the most notable spectacles, of course, being the elephant, led from its stables along Prime Street all the way up Springbank to the gardens itself. And the polar bears, so well immortalised by the name of the pub, also proved to be a very popular attraction as well. Over its years, the Zoological Gardens held all manner of creatures, peacocks, squirrels, to the more exotic like tigers and cheetahs and leopards, and even things from South America such as alpacas and llamas, although they had to be very careful not to get too many of them. They didn't want to cause an alpacalypse, or even a llamageddon. But it wasn't just animals that they had there. There were also a huge variety of rare and exotic trees and plants and flowers. This was meant to be a place where you could take a turn around the pleasure garden and enjoy yourself and not just have to look at strange and unusual animals. But there were hints that this was the early days of zookeeping from the stories that occasionally surfaced about neglect or mistreatment of the animals. There were rumours of a kangaroo being kept in a cage as small as would be suitable for a cat, or a Bengal tiger who was left so long without any care that their claws began to become ingrown. Now, in the case of the tiger, it got picked up by the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and yes, that is the precursor to the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals we know today, the RSPCA. They gathered their information and reported it to the police, but while the courts did nothing, public pressure because of the exposure of the case amongst the people of Hull meant that the Zoological Gardens were forced to employ a surgeon to look after the Bengal tiger, which must have been a fairly terrifying prospect for the surgeon, because it's a tiger, not renowned for being the gentlest or easiest of animals to deal with, and also renowned for being able to reduce a man into meat in seconds. So they came up with a novel solution in what I can only describe as one of the most brilliantly Heath Robinson displays of early surgery on animals that I can actually imagine. They didn't have anaesthetic darts fired from guns in those days. Rather, they dipped sponges in chloroform and strapped them to the end of poles and then shoved them in the tiger's face until it got groggy enough to be roped up. Now, this took a while, and a number of sticks and sponges were sadly lost during the process. But eventually the tiger was reduced to a point where it could be roped up safely so that the surgeon could go in and perform the operation, which, by the way, was a complete success. The Bengal tiger made a full recovery and remained a fantastic attraction at the gardens. But the Zoological Gardens weren't always bad to their animals, especially after the bad publicity of the Bengal tiger incident. There was records, for instance, of an enormous amount of care given to a cheetah that came from Egypt with a broken leg. The assessment was made and every effort was made to save the leg, but unfortunately they did have to amputate. The operation, however, was a complete success and the animal made a full recovery. Well, I mean, it didn't grow a leg back, but it recovered from the operation fine without any complications, is what I'm trying to say. But the Zoological Gardens was more than just animals, and it was more than just plants and trees and shrubs as well. And over the years, a whole variety of other types of attractions sprang up in its grounds, including a pair of giant fish tanks full of exotic and wild fish that were erected in the 1850s. Or there could be the shooting gallery, for instance, which must have been great fun for all the nervous animals that were around the park. Or the centrifugal railway, which was a kind of early roller coaster with a loop-the-loop in the middle of it, which must have proved equal parts amazing and also terrifying for the locals who went on it. And there were many others as well. There was a small incubator where hopeful visitors could try and catch sight of a baby bird hatching from an egg, or you could watch infant chimps being cared for by their mothers. There was a huge amount of temporary attractions that would turn up, such as the hippopotamus that was on loan from another zoo for a few months. Well, it was actually supposed to only be for a few weeks, but they ended up so popular it stayed for months and was eventually immortalised in the river horse statue at the top of Albany Street. But the Victorians weren't exactly well known for their health and safety, And whilst people today might moan about health and safety legislation, a quick look back at the track record of places like the Zoological Gardens and indeed pretty much any Victorian industry you care to mention shows you exactly why such legislation was needed. The Zoological Gardens had its fair share of incidents. There was a keeper was bitten in the leg by an angry camel. There was a young child whose chest was slashed by one of the big cats. And there was a girl whose face was lacerated by a monkey. And whilst there weren't any fatalities caused by the animals, there was a man in 1853 who blew himself up trying to set up a firework display. So there's that. But it wasn't all tragedy at the Zoological Gardens. Some of the stories that the gardens are most renowned for are of the more light-hearted variety, such as the Elephant Trail, which is commemorated by a series of carved paving stones along Springbank. You look down, you may notice them every so often. And they mark the journey that was made every day by the elephant from its stables in Prime Street to the gardens itself. And there were a few events that happened along this trail from time to time, such as the time an elephant walked over an empty coal cellar and the pavement collapsed, leaving the poor stricken animal in a big hole. It was eventually helped out with boards and planks, but it was otherwise unharmed. Or there was the time when it was walking past a bakery and the smell of baking gingerbread wafted out was so enticing to the animal that it decided it wanted to have some and made a run at the bakery. Luckily, the handlers caught it off guard and managed to actually get it back under control before it could do some serious damage to the bakery. Or there was the time that the Zoological Gardens lost a stag that ran away, and it was pursued across by all and sundry in the town. It must have been quite the event. 4 young boys managed to lasso it with a rope around its neck, and then a gentleman who took charge and took hold of the rope, because clearly it wasn't a job for boys but a job for men, got dragged through a ditch and nearly drowned as he tried to hang on to the animal. Eventually it was caught after leading a merry chase both sides of the banks of the River Hull, and it was finally returned. But of course, every self-respecting Victorian pleasure garden had to have a gala season, and the Zoological Gardens were no exception. The gala season ran every year from May to October, and in the early seasons they were increasingly lavish, featuring firework displays, multicoloured fountains, hot air balloons, acrobats and music. These early galas were such an event that many local businesses actually closed early to allow the staff to attend. But as time wore on and profits began to thin, the galas became less extravagant, more strained and less exciting. But running a zoo is an expensive business. You've got to pay surgeons and keepers to look after the animals, and you've got to pay groundskeepers and gardeners to look after the grounds themselves. And all of this was paid for from the ticket prices. Because that's right, the Zoological Gardens weren't free to get in, you had to pay. And they came in criticism for this right from their earliest days in the 1840s, because the ticket prices were such that most of the people in Hull simply couldn't afford them. This whole idea of educating people in natural history and allowing them to go for healthful walks apparently only applied to fairly wealthy individuals. The Lord Mayor of Hull personally took umbrage at this and decided that he was going to try and raise a bill to force the park to open for free for 1 day a week, just so that it could accommodate all these people. But even though he passed the bill, the Zoological Gardens pretty much ignored it. The place got a reputation for being a playground for the wealthy, to such an extent that it started to attract cut purses and footpads. And just to dispel a myth that things were better back in the day, there were so many people, young offenders, being sent away to hard labour for their attempts to pick the pockets of the wealthy outside the park, or even inside it. And just to prove that we don't have a monopoly on antisocial behaviour in the 21st century, vandalism of the park was rife. The statues, the enclosures, the fountains, all would be targets of vandals. Various things would be stolen, even animals would be stolen. It was not a pretty picture, and, unfortunately, Victorian society was just as, if not more, violent and antisocial than we have today. But despite all of this, the 1840s and even the early 1850s were still a heyday for the park. It made plenty of money. But that wasn't to last. The park itself started to fade in the 1850s. The galas became less expansive and less opulent and fewer in number. The park began to become run down and shabby as debts began to mount. And eventually it all came too close. In 1861, the park was forced to close and sell off the land, which was then later packaged off and sold to developers for housing during the 1880s and 1890s, giving rise to the streets in which we now see down Springbank. And part of the reason for its failure was probably its location. You see, if you look at the old maps, Springbank was the last of the main routes out of Old Hull to be developed. And there's a very, very good reason for that. And it's in the name, Springbank. You see, along Springbank, there are numerous small, slightly dirty wells that kind of spring up from the ground in the clay. And it's not really much use for drinking water because it's basically the same colour as you see in the River Hull. And it made the ground around there a perpetual mud-soaked quagmire, no matter what time of the year. So every time people went down there to get to the zoological gardens, they would end up looking caked in mud, particularly around their shoes and the bottom of their dresses and their trousers. And when you're catering to the wealthy, they often want to make an event of this. If you look at the idea of the Victorian Pleasure Garden, it was a place where Sunday best was worn. You know, you'd put your finest rags on so that you could show everybody else just how wonderfully turned out you were. And yet everybody would have had ruined muddy shoes and terrible muddy hems on their dresses and trousers. Even if you'd only just got out of a carriage outside, it still would have meant stepping on the squidgy horribleness of Springbank. And you can still tell that Springbank is inundated with water even to this day. I once owned a house down Middleton Street, and when we first bought it, we had the floorboards taken up as the guy was checking for dry rot, and there was just water pooled underneath, like a strange, dirty private paddling pool, about 4 or 5 feet under the floorboards. I was horrified, and I was like, well, you know, that's not good. And he said, actually, that's fairly common round here. That's why it's called Springbank. And the more I looked into it, the more I realised that, oh yeah, so it is. And that's why it didn't get developed for so long. Hessel Road, Anlaby Road, Beverley Road, all of these roads were great avenues for spreading out the development of the city of Hull. But Springbank was not easy to build on because it was so boggy. It wasn't until building techniques actually improved in the latter part of the 19th century that they actually managed to be able to build these high suspended floors to get away from the problems of the damp. But whatever the reasons behind the decline of the zoological gardens, decline they did. And by 1861, they were gone, and very quickly written over by a series of streets and houses and alleyways and shops. Today, there's pretty much no indication that there was ever a zoological gardens here. It existed for 21 years, but it was over 150 years ago. There's nothing left. The only clue we have, really, is the name of the polar bear pub. And that's not even the original polar bear. It's one that took the name from the original polar bear that was itself demolished. So, sometimes there's almost nothing left, except the written history. And in this instance, that's exactly what's happened here. The only way we know anything at all about the zoological gardens is from what was written at the time and in the historical record and the old maps. Sometimes there's just nothing left above the surface.